I am Victoria L. Burson. This is Leadership on the Go. Leadership is not always preparedness for the unknown, but it is tapping into the unknown prepared. Good evening and good evening and good evening. Thank you for joining Essentials Unleashed, presenting Leadership on the Go. Listen, we are counting down. This is part one of two series of sexuality and spirituality. We're going to have our organic conversation this evening like none other on Leadership on the Go. Are you ready or are you ready? Listen, I just want you to like, tag, and share. Like, tag, and share. We're also on YouTube. Let your friends know that they can reach us on YouTube as well. And I am excited about our guests. Our guests are wonderful, 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 wonderful people. And they will be I will introduce them and they'll tell you a little bit about what they're doing. But I can tell you it's an extraordinary group of people that I'm so very excited about. This conversation, I'm going to tell you right now, is not for the faint at heart. This conversation is not for the faint at heart. But I must say, Essentials Unleashed disclaimer is this conversation is intended for an adult audience. We will be talking about sex, sexuality, and spirituality. Opinions expressed are those of the person conveying them and not of Essentials Unleashed. We appreciate your participation. Please remember, this platform does not promise privacy, so it's up to you. Remember, this is a conversation intended for a mature and adult audience. Tonight's guests are some of the most eclectic yet mind-blowing clergy persons within the LGBT plus community in the whole world. They have been doing this work as scholars, as activists, as theologians, as diversity and inclusion and justice people for many years. I have probably a collective of 200 years of work that's going to be coming before you. So let's get started. Y'all don't want to hear from me. Let's get started with our esteemed guests. The first up is Apostle Edward Donaldson. Apostle Edward Donaldson is a phenomenal scholar, theologian, author, professor, dean, all that stuff. Won't you tell the people a little bit about you?
Wow, thank you for that amazing introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I serve as the director of the Doctor of Ministry program for Seattle University's School of Theology and Ministry, and currently my work centers on the intersection of race, gender, and sexuality. Right now, I'm living with the work that I have published, the Black Lives Matter movement toward an intersectional theology. So I'm excited for tonight's conversation.
Me too. Thank you so much for being present. Next, we have Reverend Will Horn, a phenomenal pastor, phenomenal student and scholar and theologian. Come on and share with the people what you would, thus says the Lord.
Oh my goodness. Thank you again, my sister, for trusting my voice and having me to be a part of this amazing conversation today. I'm really very excited about it.
Come on and share with. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Currently, I've come out of the pastoral pulpit and I've devoted myself to full-time study. I am a Master of Theological Studies student over at Bright Divinity School at Texas Christian University. I'm very excited about that. I have also written a book that has surprisingly helped a whole lot of people. It's called The Handbook, What the Bible Does and Does Not Say About Homosexuality. And that has been a tremendous blessing, particularly to our young people who are really trying to reconcile faith and orientation and family relationships and so forth. And so, again, I'm really very, very excited that we're having this conversation today. I think some lives are going to be changed by it.
I'm excited as well. Thank you for participating. Next. Oh, wow. We have Bishop Joseph TOLTON of the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries. Come on, Bishop, and tell the people what the exciting work that you're doing. I love this man. Come on. And I love everyone, but come on and tell everyone what you're doing and your work.
Bless you, Pastor Victoria Burson. It's such a pleasure to be here, and to my most esteemed colleagues, I'm just gracious to be on this virtual dais with you. I serve as the Bishop of Global Ministries for the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, and what we are doing is what TFAM has done in the United States. We are, from an international perspective, building out a network of faith organizations and community-based institutions that are working to advance the cause of LGBTI justice, both in sacred and secular spaces. It is a blessing to be able to partner with people from around the world who are like-minded in their faith and social aspirations as it relates to leading the people of God out of the wilderness and into a promised land. It's a blessing to be here today.
Thank you, and it's a blessing to have you. Thank you. Reverend Jamie Washington, a wonderful brother who hails right here from Baltimore, Maryland. So come and tell the people about you.
Wonderful. Yes. Good evening, afternoon. It may be late afternoon in some places, but it's good evening here in the Baltimore area. I am so delighted to be here with this distinguished group of siblings as we are in the conversation that the church is needed to be in. So I get to serve as an elder in the Unity Fellowship Church movement and have been connected to the movement for over 20 some odd years and serve as the pastor of the Unity Fellowship Church of Baltimore. Also serve as the president and founder of the Social Justice Training Institute and the Washington Consulting Group, where our ministry is to help heal the planet through liberation and the breaking down and dismantling of racism and all areas of oppression. So delighted to be here in this conversation tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being present. I am so excited to have you. Yes. Reverend NAOMI Washington-LEAPHEART, a wonderful, wonderful soul scholar, theologian. Come on and share with the people who you are, what you're doing right now.
Hey, everybody. My name is NAOMI Washington-LEAPHEART, and I'm in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Ooh. And I feel really grateful to be in this conversation and to bring voice from my experience as a preacher, as a professor, and as a public faith leader. I serve the city of Philadelphia as the director for faith-based and interfaith affairs, and so trying to bring some moral clarity to the halls of government here in Philly. And I teach theology at Villanova University, so always interested in the kind of theological courage we can develop in the classroom. And, you know, I'm involved with TFAM, of course, beloved. I'm grateful to be able to follow the leadership of our beloved Bishop Yvette Flunder. And I've also recently been fellowshipping with the Good Neighbor Movement, which is a congregation based in North Carolina with kind of satellites all over the country. And so I'm just grateful to be here tonight. Thank you, Pastor Burson, for this invitation.
I am so honored that you are a part of this. And I heard about the Good Neighbor. And I love what you said about theology that encourages. That is wonderful. So thank you for being present. Okay, and then we have Reverend Dr. TERESA Smallwood. I don't have to introduce, she's been a part of.
Victoria, you are muted.
I'm so sorry, I said a whole lot. I'm saying I don't need to introduce you because you have been part of the, all of just about 90% of leadership on the go. Really, you have been kind of like the resident house theologian, and I appreciate you being present. So thank you. Tell people a little bit about you, if you would.
Certainly, and good evening to you all. I am in Nashville, Tennessee at Vanderbilt Divinity School running the Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative. And the collaborative's work is designed to really bring consciousness, raise consciousness, and open our own minds towards the work of scholars, activists, community leaders, clergy, students, and everyone to work together to create synergy, to operate in such a fashion that all of our gifts make a difference in what it is that we're trying to achieve. I find in the world that everyone really that I come in contact with seems to want some of the same things, but working in our silos sometimes really reduces the impact.
It really does. Working in silos. I'm glad that you brought that up. It does reduce the impact. So thank you for mentioning that. And finally, we have Reverend Lewis Mitchell, wonderful, wonderful, mind-blowing person. I just tell you, he's a wonderful scholar. Come on, Lewis, if you will, just a great friend of mine. Introduce yourself to the people. Let us know what you're doing and what God is doing in your world.
I want to begin by saying thank you. I feel like a bit of a fanboy with this panel, just going, wow, how do I get to be a part of this club? This is amazing to me. I am currently serving as a bridge pastor at Alki United Church of Christ in West Seattle, Washington, and the co-founder of Trans Faith, a longtime institution designed for and by trans people of every faith, spirit, and energetic practice. I am probably more known for being an agitator and a troublemaker than a theologian, but speaking the bland, bold truth is a part of my theology. I feel like we've been so caught up in the optics of a thing, and it's time for us to get into the substance of a thing.
Thank you for participating. I appreciate all of you being here. And so now that you've mentioned it, let's get to the conversation. All right. So I'm excited. I want everyone to answer this question real briefly. Why is this conversation of sex, sexuality, and spirituality so important, particularly in this season of church and community in the Black and Brown communities? And we'll just start with Dr. Donaldson.
And mighty quick. I think it's really important because while sexuality is rooted in our bodied realities, it's much larger than our bodied realities, right? It is about our minds, our feelings, our wills, our memories. Longfellow says it's about our self-understandings and our powers as embodied persons. And so it is embodied and disembodied reality simultaneously. As we are in a very particular historical moment, we are consciously forming and reforming our self-understandings. We can't do that fully if we leave sexuality off the table. I think it's imperative at this moment for us to have a conversation while we think through who we will be as people going forward, as siblings, as community, as global village.
Oh, wow. Thank you for that. I like that, reforming our self-understanding. We're going to talk more about that later. I'm quite sure it'll come up in the conversation. Reverend Will Horn.
Well, thank you again for that question. And thank you for allowing me really to answer it. I really feel a sense of urgency related to this. And for some, that would seem a bit ironic that, you know, the preacher, the Black Pentecostal preacher, would have a sense of urgency about talking about sex. But the truth is that people are having sex, and they're having a lot of it, and they're having it at church. And some of it is not consensual, and some of it is from very broken places. And we have a cycle of abuse that is happening because we're not having honest conversations about sex and sexuality. And so I believe those of us who have been given these kinds of platforms, actually, when we speak openly and from an erudite kind of place, we give people the language and the courage to be able to talk about sex and sexuality. And I think when we do that, then we can say that we really do have holistic ministries, because you can't really, you know, minister to the spiritual part of a person and not talk about the sexual part of the person, which is just as important. And so when we marry those two things together, then we got some whole people sitting in the pews. So.
All right. I love it. I love it. Oh, I'm excited about this. Reverend Naomi, come on with it.
Thank you. So, I think that the pandemic actually has presented to us both a challenge and an opportunity, right? We are able to see possibility perhaps in places we didn't before because we've been living through a global pandemic. And so I think now is, as has been said, the urgent and opportune time to reconsider everything, including, how we construct our intimacies, right? The pandemic has taught us something new about intimacy, about being community, about the difference between proximity and relationship, right? We've had to be intentional. We've had to be deliberate, right? So I think now is a good time, since we're talking about how we emerge from this moment better and changed, to fold in sexuality, sex, and spirituality into that discussion. We're not just talking about public health outcomes. We're talking, as Pastor Horn said, about wholeness outcomes. I think that the pandemic has also exposed our vulnerabilities. We perhaps are admitting things now that we weren't willing to admit before, or we couldn't admit before. We are exposing our patterns, the ruts that we've fallen into, and now we're trying to innovate out of them. So I just think that, now is a good time. We should use this crisis moment, this moment of devastation, actually, to rearrange and reconstruct everything, including what we think and what we do related to sex, sexuality, and spirituality.
Oh, I love it. And I particularly love we need to construct our intimacies. Now that, Lord Jesus. Let me just keep on moving. Dr. Jamie.
Thank you. So much brilliance and power. And one of my mentors, Elder Claude Bowen, said, "You're only as sick as your secrets." That part of the sickness of the church, particularly, and it shows up in powerful ways in the Black church, is our secrets. And sexuality is one of those major secrets. And it starts with the way that we understand and read and interpret the scriptures, the secrets of Jesus and sexuality, the secrets of Mary and sexuality. You just, all of the secrets, and secrets just turn into lies and just a whole bunch of other foolishness that has us show up in ways that does not free the people. It keeps people in bondage. And if we can, particularly in this contextual moment, begin to dismantle the secrets, break the silence around the secrets, then we can have some healing and some wholeness. Connected to that for me is that we conflate sex, sexuality, understanding of sexual identity, and we put those all together. So we ain't talking about nothing. We need to talk about all of it.
Oh, Lord. I'm just so excited. That is wonderful. And I love what your mentor had to say, that you are as sick as your secrets. And that is so, so very true. Let me just, I'm getting excited. Bishop Joseph Tolton.
I'm sorry, I am.
There you go.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
This is the age of the divine feminine. And whether the issue is climate change, economic justice, whether the issue is autocracy versus democracy, at its root core, the driver of these issues is the imperial desire to control or dominate, which is totally planted and rooted in the soil of patriarchy. If it sucks, why can't it also lick? We as a people, as a human race, are groping towards a new understanding of God's fullness in God's maleness and God's femaleness and all that is in between. And I believe that the urgency around this conversation around sex and sexuality is about radically, as Bishop Apostle Donaldson said, transforming our God view, that we can therefore transform our worldview.
But let me just tell you something. You just transformed people's worldview, because you said if it could be, if it's sucked, why can't it be licked? I'm just done. We've already started the conversation. We've been started the conversation, but that quote right there, but I do like that you noticed or have said and stated that we are in a divine feminine. And I really do appreciate you noting that, right? So thank you for that. Reverend Lewis, come on.
You know, so much of what has been said is true. And when we talk about sex, sexuality, and spirituality, I see it as a time, a pressing time to finally weave together holiness and wholeness. And, you know, when you were talking, one of the things that I jotted down was that shame and secrecy seed so many feelings of unworthiness that they stand in our way to fully stand in the callings that we have. We can't even fully stand in the callings because shame and secrecy are blocking us. And so not just kind of globally sex, sexuality, and spirituality, but we need to talk about yearning and desire and consent and behavior, in which each of those streams lead us to and what each of those streams lead us away from. That's at the core. I don't care what kind of sex you have and what kind of parts and pieces you're having it with. All of those things are important to consider. And the final thing I'll say is that if you can't love your body in the way that it needs to be loved, how on earth can you love anyone else in the name of God or in any other way?
That is so, so, so true. And I like how you frame, we're in a pressing sense of urgency for holiness and wholeness. And if you can't love your body, how can you love anyone else or even their bodies? Oh, that is powerful. Reverend Dr. Teresa.
My goodness, I feel like I'm at a disadvantage being last. This is powerful stuff.
Yes.
And, you know, so much has been touched upon that I believe really kind of filters in this comment. The Black church, as it were, established through the hush harpers, took on the concept of hushing,
yes,
for the purpose of survival. We understand that. But hushing has been a tool used by our hegemonic patriarchal subliminal as well as overt operatives who call themselves masters. And so we need these kinds of conversations for the purpose of unleashing the shackles, taking the shackles off of not only the church, but off the people in the church, and giving them the voice to stop hushing and find a reason for praise. Because I believe my prophet is Audre Lorde, and what thus says the Lord is that the power of the erotic is useful to the work, and the work that we are summoned to do requires every power. We can't operate without a sexual power, an erotic power. So if we leave one aspect of our power out, somewhere along the line, our work is without real substance.
Wow, wow, wow. I just love it. You all have said so much. And I like how you have named this whole hush concept, right? And that the hush concept is used to continue to perpetuate power to oppress, power to disenfranchise. And so I really love how you said it takes all of the power, even the erotic power. And so we're going to continue in this conversation. Listen, y'all ready? Let's dive in. We're going to have a conversation, and whoever wants to jump in and answer, you could just give me your hand, or you can give me the virtual hand. There's no virtual hand. Just give me a hand or just speak. And so the next question we have here, what is the point, after hearing all the great things that each of you have stated, what is the point of an embodied Christ if the body is bad? And I think someone alluded to that earlier in our discussion. So again, what is the point of an embodied Christ if the body is so bad? Who wants to go first in that? Ooh. I knew it. Come on, Reverend Will.
Listen, such a huge part of my ministry right now is simply getting people to identify with Jesus's body. Period. we have been taught that Jesus is here and we are here.
Right.
And we have not been able to find ourselves in Jesus's experience. Neither do we see that Jesus is involved or connected to our experiences. We see Jesus as Savior, but we never see Jesus as model or as prototype or as big brother, so to speak. And so because there is this disconnect, it's easy for us to say that Jesus was perfect, but we're wretched. And we've got to be able to turn that thing around so that we've got positive images of ourselves. How can we say that God is good and we are bad? We don't take the time to think through our own theology. We don't take time to think through the cognitive dissonance that it takes to say that we are created in the image of God. And that Jesus was the embodiment, the visual representation of God. How can we believe that and then believe such negative things about ourselves? And so I think when we do a better job of helping people to really bring together that Jesus was sent here to help us to understand that if we tap into that same grace, that same Christ consciousness, we'd be able to walk just as Jesus did. And so there's a lot of work, that has to happen there. I would love to talk about the sexuality of Jesus. I hope we can get to that while we're here. But people really need to be able to connect to the humanness of Jesus and then also allow that perfection of Jesus to connect to our humanness as well.
All right. Yes. Dr. Donaldson.
I have to thank you, Reverend Horn, for bringing us to talk about the humanity of Jesus. If we are to take the text seriously in any way, we have to look at John 1:14, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us. We have to begin to see the person of Jesus as a Jewish insurgent born under Palestinian occupation, right? We have to, this Palestinian Jew, rather, born under Roman occupation, we have to deal with the fact that Jesus is gendered and Jesus is sexed by the text. The text tells us that Jesus is circumcised on the 8th day. We can't have a conversation about sexuality, and the human body without realizing that the scripture itself genders and sexes the body of Jesus. And those things are important because his role in society as it plays out is connected to that embodiment. This idea of Emmanuel, God with us, this enfleshment. There is no hypostatic union. There is no fully God and fully man if the man part is not also sexualized, because that's what it means to be a whole human individual. What happens when we start taking seriously the idea that Jesus was tempted in all points, as are we, yet without sin? Well, this idea of missing the mark, hermetia, this idea of not making the excellence of one's highest self becomes impossible if one is not in one's own body. So getting grounded in this idea of an embodied Jesus is of paramount importance if we're ever going to have spiritual excellence.
This is really, really, really good. Come on, Naomi.
Yeah, this
Reverend
is good.
Naomi. I mean, no disrespect.
No. So I think that in addition to doing what has been said, which is taking seriously Jesus's enfleshed status, if we look at the work and ministry of Jesus, Jesus was concerned with other people's bodies. Right. That he's, it's a messy gospel. Folk rubbing up against each other, folk in crowds, you got saliva and dirt, and you got laying on of hands, and you've got bleeding, and you've got, right. And so, embodiedness is, I think, central to Jesus's work and ministry. So we can't profess to be following Jesus if we're not also, I think, preoccupied to a degree with bodies. and the wholeness of bodies. I also think that part of the theological reconstruction that we need to do, or reformation that we need to do, is related to the body as merely a pass-through or a conduit or an instrument, right? My body is a temple of God. All these things we have inherited in our religious tradition, which sort of operationalize the body. The body has a function, a purpose, but in itself is not of value. In itself is not, right? And so pleasure, or, even to some degree, pain, my body is just the vehicle for something else. And I think that contributes to our negative view.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Bishop Tolton.
I just love the arc of what was said by Apostle Donalson and Reverend Naomi in terms of what it really means to reconsider the sanctity of our body and the purpose of our body. And even after Jesus died, Paul says, if the spirit of him that raised Jesus from the dead dwell in you, it will quicken or bring alive your mortal body. He doesn't say it's going to quicken your spirit or renew you from the inside, but he literally says it is your body that will come alive. Because I believe, as Reverend Naomi said, that body has far more utility than just kind of being this vehicle for this journey while I'm moving and passing through this way.
That's good. That's good. That's good. Reverend Will, you started the sexuality of Jesus Christ. I know you got something to say. So.
Well, I mean, again, in Apostle Donaldson really made the point that I wanted to make. When we say that he was not an high priest who's not able to be touched with the feelings of all of our infirmities, if we really believe that Jesus, if his time here on earth was to identify with us, how then could he really understand our struggle if he was not sexualized? You can look historically and traditionally, and it would be very, very hard to understand that a 30-year-old Jewish carpenter was not married or did not have children. I was having a conversation with someone, and sometimes I have conversations really just for the shock value. But I said, just imagine for a moment Jesus with an erection, and the pearls just got clutched, and it is unfortunate that again we have removed Jesus from his body.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Sexual arousal is just as normal as a hunger pang or us needing air. It is that simple. And what we have done is really kind of cut off our nose to spite our face, so to speak. Because I just don't know very many people who don't enjoy sex. And I do believe that God gave us sex and made it feel good as a gift to humanity. And we need to learn how to embrace that.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And so thank you so much. So with all this, and we're talking about the embodied Christ and the sexuality of Christ, and all that has been said and mentioned, then where do the ideas and this whole notion of sex and sexuality being wrong or demonized come from? And if Dr. Teresa and Reverend Lewis and Dr. Jamie would kind of respond to that.
I feel like the infant among a group of scholars here, but I'm just going to say it and get it out of the way. Somehow, the most holy people latched onto this weird Gnostic strain that the body is evil. And then we forgot where we got that from and included it in some doctrinal stuff and made what was seen as heretical more than holy. I don't understand how that works. I mean, I'm a babe at this, so I don't understand how that all came about. But somehow this weird Gnostic strain of everything embodied is bad somehow leached itself into the secret and shaming parts of the church fathers. And I want to go back to something that Reverend Dr. Smallwood said. We have turned a useful survival strategy in the Black church into a gospel teaching. One more time, that hushed thing which helped us live through leached itself into a doctrinal practice that we never interrogate where it came from. And I'm going to say what I wanted to say. We never interrogate where the hell it came from. And I mean that intentionally.
Right.
And somehow we've taken this weird schizophrenic practice of non-sexuality, non-embodiment, this Gnostic separation as being somehow more holy, while at the same time holding on to patriarchal practice of using charisma and sexual power as men from the pulpit to control and subdue under the auspices of being holy. I know I said a lot there, but I'm talking real talk right now about how men move in the church. And I know that as a holy hybrid because I've been able to see it as a man and I've been able to see it as a woman. And I can tell the differences in how I've been treated in my journey. And there's a real thing. And when we talk about that spirit quickening, Bishop Tolton, that, you know, when you're reading common literature, quickening means you got a stiffy. Right. And I think there's a way in which we don't want to admit that there is an erotic part of our praise and worship in the Black church. It's intentionally erotic and intentionally compelling because it draws people in, and just like a good drug, it might make you lose your discernment and you will buy into some stuff that really isn't for you.
Wow, thank you for that. Whichever one want to go.
So, you know, one of the things that really trips me up about how we operate in the church with such traditionalism, we only sing about all things come of thee, O God, when we've taken in money. But all things come of thee, O God.
All things.
Have we given thee?
All things.
That word thing, because, you know, when I was a little girl, that's what the man's penis was, a thing. And I was, you know, conflicted a little bit. But the idea about this thing being holy comes from Luke. Because when the baby Jesus was born, he said it's a holy thing. Yes. So in this comes what I think Shawn Copeland does so very well in her book, In Fleshing Freedom. Well, what comes of this is the ability to free ourselves from those things that have kept us bound in this notion that something escaped God's memory. It got fixed, created, put in place, and set into the cosmos without God knowing. No. And if we could just get straight the fact that Adam is not a noun, okay? It's a word that says being.
Right.
And if the being comes here with every part of itself being capable of being masculine and feminine, we need to understand God performed the first transition surgery.
Yes.
And in that comes a freedom to understand a creativeness in God.
Yes.
That sees and loves all of God's creation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Woo.
Such power. And I just want to add, we cannot erase this conversation from the dynamics of white supremacy.
That's right.
Right.
And the impact of particularly for those of us in the Black church.
That's right.
And our desire and need to survive, right, on many levels, and show up as civilized, right? And so we have taken on some stuff that don't have nothing, some more stuff that don't have nothing to do with our truth and our natural knowing of self.
Yes.
So that we show up in ways and have embodied and have accepted lies about who we are, and the role of race, particularly in America, these Americas, cannot be lost in this conversation. And that, so when we think about, so where did this notion of sex being bad, as we talk about, Gnostics, as we talk about puritanical, as we talk about all of that stuff, we really do have to hold the harm and our inability to, again, to look at where the hell, as my brother says, this stuff has come from, that keeps us bound. So I needed to add the race cut to the conversation.
Absolutely.
That's right.
That creates some of the harm as well. And so as we look at all of that, then so for me, as I look at this, some might say that as we come to this conversation, as those who might be kind of left of center in terms of our liberalism around sexuality and so on, and the questioning of our own sexual identities, all of that stuff gets thrown into the mix. I'm concerned about the harm that's being done in the Black church across sexualities.
Yes.
Not just the harm that's done to LGBTQANI and queer folks. I'm talking about the mother of the church.
Yes.
The daughters of the church who have been lied to and abused, and it's the stuff that we've already talked about, whose bodies have been made wrong, their desires have been made wrong, the children and that's why this conversation needs to be had. And sometimes I think when I'm together in an audience like this, there's often an assumption that this is a queer focused conversation.
Right.
And I just want to trouble that
Yes.
as we're in this as well.
Yes.
Right. Go ahead, Bishop.
And I think the point of bringing in the racial element is just so super important, in that historically in slavery, our bodies were beaten.
Yep.
Right.
Morning, noon, and night. And not only were our women raped, but there is the unspoken rape of our men. And we bear that emotional legacy literally in our bodies. Politically, we reacted to the internalized shame by creating the politics of respectability. And then spiritually, we reacted to it by creating this kind of unhinged and unattainable idea of the holiness code. And I think that we as African Americans need a healing as it relates to speaking over our bodies and the wholeness and the sanctity of our bodies by addressing the travesty that was unleashed upon us and that we internalized in our bodies.
Absolutely. Reverend Naomi.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly say that, so we've talked about the kind of theological impositions that have happened. We talked about the racialized impositions, and I just want to throw in the economic one, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think, disembodiment is rewarded economically in our culture, right? To be out of your body or to sacrifice, surrender, offer your body, to be a disembodied brain. We have expressions like talking heads, right? So it pays well and it pays off to be disembodied in our culture. And so one of the things that we have to do is also critique the capitalist system, right? That expects our bodies to be machines, again, conduits for productivity, conduits for entertainment and titillation, right? And not actually part of who we are and how we actually experience the divine.
Absolutely.
That's good. That's good. That's good. So in saying all of this, what is actually sex and what is sexuality? Because I think people, conversations I've had, people sometimes confuse sex and sexuality with behaviors, and they limit it to who we sleeping with, right? And so I really want us to flesh out what is sex and what is sexuality? And whoever wants to go and answer either or both, because they're intertwined, and some people see them separately. And we'll get to the spirituality part of it later. Dr. Donaldson?
So I'd really like to talk about what is sexuality, because as I understand it, sexuality in sum is the physiological and emotional grounding of our capacities to love. And then it also includes our feelings, our interpretations, and behaviors through which we express our capacities for sensuous relationships with ourselves first, and then secondarily with others, and the tertiary expression is with the world around us. It is not limited to genital contact, whether that genital contact is willing or unwilling, whether or not that genital contact is intentional behavior or accidental behavior. That's where the focus tends to be. But your sexuality is so far beyond the realm of what you do with bits and parts. It starts first in how you see yourself, how you love yourself, how you see the other and love the other, and then how you see and love the whole world. When you ask the question about what is sex, it very much depends on who you are asking. Are you asking about what is sex as defined by one's physicality, or what is sex as defined by an activity or a behavior? Those sex can be used for both one's physicality, or because gender is performative, let's be clear. So gender is off the table in this question. We're talking about one's biology, one's arrangement, one's physicality, or one's behavior. Sexuality is rooted in one's personhood and one's identity and one's way of being in the world, as I understand it.
Well, I like how you understand it, because I wanted to ask that question so we could flesh that out, because people who are listening and who will listen to the replay tend to minimize sexuality. And we tend to make sex all about the physical, right? And then we tend to separate those two. And we even do more damage by separating them from our spirituality and our faith journey. So thank you for answering that. Anybody else want to go with that?
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here really quickly because I really do feel like, and I appreciate Apostle Donaldson naming, kind of this broader, more expansive kind of understanding. The words get conflated all the time. And as we go back to, when I do work around inviting folks to engage the conversation, to break the silence around. So let's talk about sex or sexuality. And I said, what'd you learn growing up about sexuality? And you would be surprised at the kinds of responses where people automatically go when the question is, what did you learn about sexuality? What do you understand that to be? And what you've named is sexuality is a complex, beautiful phenomena, right? There's a lot that we know and a lot that we don't know about sexualities. The messages that we've gotten certainly is that you are born this, you are assigned this, and therefore that means this, and therefore this should happen, right? And it is far more complex than our biology and our physiology, our gender identity and our gender expression and connection to that, our capacity to love and to whom we connect to and have compassion for, and that sexual connection is different than our romantic connection, right? Necessarily, right? And so it just gets into, then our behavior is different than all of that, right? And so it's a complex, and then how you see and name yourself invites in others, because, I can behave differently than what is natural to me, right? If the price is right.
Say more.
So, I have often said, to folks, is like, well, if I asked you, my right-handed folks on the screen, right-handed folks, raise your right hand. Right hand. So if I asked you to write me a paper with your left hand, could you do it? Well, if I said the reward for doing that would be $1 million, you could stop all this work and you could just go in. Could you do it? Well, it might not be your best work, but you could get it done, right? And so the cost-benefit analysis in terms of, am I able to perform differently than what is truth and natural for me, shows up in our sexualities as well, right? And so this whole notion of, well, last week you was with a girl, this week you with a boy, all of that kind of stuff. Well, and why did you say this over? Well, maybe it was about the cost-benefit analysis. Maybe it is about my complete expanded capacity to love beyond one thing, right? And connect beyond one thing. But it's complex, right? And it is beyond binary thinking and dualism, which the Christian church locks us into. It locks us into either or thinking, good, bad, right or wrong, black and white, male, female, all of that stuff. And we have to, again, be able to deconstruct that and look at all the ways it shows up in all of our understandings around lots of things that has us in bondage and keeps us in harm. And so sexuality, there is no, for me, just kind of simple answer, just like I said, so what is race? Well, okay, it's a lot. Right. And, as you come to kind of understand that there's scholarship about all of this stuff. Right. But lots of folks assume just because you have it that you understand it. No, we don't understand it. And most folks I know, particularly in the church, do not understand the beautiful complexities of sexualities.
Or do we want to understand?
Yeah, we don't.
Or the church always teaches us that we need to understand because we need to be put into a particular bubble, a particular category around these things.
Yeah.
Reverend Lewis.
Yeah.
I just want to say something very quickly. I mean, we talk about sex and sexuality, but when we're thinking about it, I'm thinking about consensual, mutual sex and sexuality. But there's more to sex and sexuality than that. And I think it's gendered, it's raced, it's economic.
That's right.
And, I have a theme running through my head from Eve to Cardi B. How do we punish empowered women? There's a theme in my head. Like, you done said too much with all the wrong words. I need you to stay in your place. We will make history distort who you are to punish you for that, no matter what. And I think on the male side, it's not sex if I've won the battle and I want to screw you. That's conquest. You hear me? It's like rape and conquest are not seen as sexual acts, and they aren't, but they are. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, there's so many things that we don't call sex and sexuality that are still behaviors that impact us from generation to generation. And I mentioned before about how that sexuality from the pulpit draws people in and numbs people, particularly young little sissy boys and women who want to get the pastor's favor, who end up keeping secrets and drowning themselves in drugs and alcohol to keep the shame down. These are all a part of our big family.
Absolutely.
And that shame and secrecy stunts our spiritual growth. And it also doesn't make us trust anyone with whom we can have a spiritual conversation about that hurt place. Because if Pastor A did it, how can I trust you, Pastor B?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And it hurts the whole kingdom when one of us commits that kind of spiritual malpractice. And I'm learning it and I'm watching it as someone new to ministry. And also, as I said, not only a holy hybrid, but someone who believes that our healing must come from the sacred braid of the spiritual and the secular. Without that sacred braid, we are not whole. Whether that's our embodiment, our sexuality, the way we separate our minds from our bodies, all of those things that divide us apart make it's not like puzzle pieces. It's like each of those cogs needs to connect for the whole thing to move forward properly. And anytime one cog is taken out as being bad, we just can't move forward in the way we are meant to spiritually.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So thank you for answering that. And so I have a question here. If God is, and I want to break it, I want to break the question up because it's a two-part. So I'm going to ask Reverend Naomi and Reverend Will Horn and Bishop Tolton, if you will answer part A, and then the rest of you part B. And so here, if God is with us and in us, then what defines inappropriate sex is question A. And question B, is sex between a man and a woman the impetus of marriage equality. So if you need the question again, I'll be glad to ask it again. And if we can, because we're shortening our time, we still got more questions we want to get out to the audience, some answers. And so from this panel. So if you can answer that like in 20, 30 seconds, that'll be wonderful. So again, part A is, if God is with us and in us, then what defines inappropriate sexual activity?
Let me go ahead, because when Bishop and Reverend Naomi go, I want to make sure I don't feel like the babe when I give my little answer. I want to go a little bit farther, because you said, if God is with us and in us, I would like to say, what about God as us? What about us being divine expressions with dominion? When do we get to make a decision about what we do with our bodies? And what happens too many times is that religion takes that autonomy and takes that dominion away. And we are reduced, really, it's almost like fiefdom, so to speak. And once we get to a place where we are able to own our bodies and own our sexuality, then the question becomes, what is inappropriate for you as an individual? I don't think that we can legislate or impose upon other people what is appropriate sexual activity for them. If it is consensual, if it is not abusive of another person, I think we get to make those decisions. And even if you want to search the scripture, sex and sexuality as it relates to religion and the church, that's always been something that has changed over time. If David or Solomon or some of the other characters in the Bible could have many wives at that time and have sex with them and their concubines, and then that's not true today. It says that society makes up those rules, and those rules change over time. And so I believe that when we get to a place where we're clear about who we really are and we own our sexuality, we are the only ones who can determine what is appropriate and what is inappropriate for our sexuality.
I would just
That
add
didn't sound
to
like a babe answer to me.
It sound like a what?
That didn't sound like no baby answer to me.
Reverend Naomi?
I was just going to briefly add that, I do think that sexual activity that is mired in shame is, I think I'm struggling or grappling with this word inappropriate, but is certainly, unholy, certainly contributes to our lack of wholeness, right? And immoral. And I think that sex that is happening without kind of enthusiastic and consistent consent, because we talk about consent in our culture, but there are all kinds of ways people have twisted and turned that thing to make it seem like, you said yes at first, but then it was a no, but the prior yes overrules the later no, right? Enthusiastic and consistent yes is, I think, a feature of appropriate sexual activity. And then I want to say, like, sex should also be good. Back to this notion of our bodies and sex as functional, as opposed to, first of all, pleasurable, right? To me, the utility comes later, maybe, right? But that it should give you release and pleasure. And if it doesn't, I think that there's some work to do.
You're right. There is a lot of work to do. All right. Who did I say name was next?
Reverend Wilhorn and our Pastor Naomi have said it well. It's been established by these great thinkers that I'm so pleased to be with tonight, that sex and sexuality is a gift from God, and it is a blessing to us. And the blessings of the Lord maketh rich, and addeth no sorrow. And I think that if we're looking at the idea of inappropriate, it really is about, does this sexual experience bring sorrow in any way, shape, or form? Therefore, then it is problematic. But if there is no sorrow with it, then it is a blessing from God.
Well put, all three of you. So part 2, is sex between a man and a woman the impetus of marriage equality? The rest of you, if you want to answer.
So when we talk impetus, it's my understanding that you're asking, is that the sort of momentum of marriage equality? And I have to say, no, not in this culture.
Absolutely.
Actually, the impetus would be what we call traditional marriage. Marriage equality has not found a normality or a normalcy as of yet, even though we have the Supreme Court weighing in on that. What we know is that we still have quite a bit of work yet left to do. But certainly the Bible talks about bedrooms. And this idea of traditional marriage is something that we need to really kind of divorce ourselves from. I've been talking divorce and unshackle a long time. and the bottom line is this: we are confusing the sacrality of marriage and covenant with some of these archaic laws that really go right back to what Dr. Washington talked about in terms of how patriarchy has shaped a great deal of our understanding about what is acceptable, right? And so when Bishop Tolton invoked the idea of how the politics of respectability began to sort of create the pietous nature of our ensuing work around spirituality, it really puts a cog in the wheel, doesn't it? For you to think in terms of a marriage, and you use the Bible as your standard, it becomes mighty problematic when you think about how marriage was considered in the biblical cultures. I mean, we had polyamorous marriages and all kinds of connectivities around concubines. Listen, Solomon had 700. I'm trying to figure out how he got through all them pairs of stockings. But nonetheless, the treatment that we have put together in our cultures and subcultures, and how we have directed the subaltern to somehow confess itself as unclean is an abomination.
Yes.
I might get in a lot of trouble and be unpopular with my response.
Go ahead and be unpopular.
Oppression only teaches how to be oppressed and how to oppress.
Yes.
Oppression never teaches us liberation. The language of marriage equality should be interrogated and problematized. Equal to what? Who was it designed to serve? Who benefits from the language of equality? As though you needed someone else to sanction and ordain or validate your love.
Speak.
Why would you diminish yourself so as to use language that would center someone else's idea of what your covenant is all about? So for me, I have to the trouble of the question. And I really don't care what the impetus is, because marriage equality is uninteresting to me. I'm disinterested in the conversation. What I'm interested in is living out the love that God designed for me to live into, and to do that in such a way as to support the health and wholeness of my family, my personhood, and my people. And the rest of it, the devil be damned, he's a cursed spirit.
And listen, these questions are only being asked to kind of jar these kind of responses, right? And so thank you for your willingness, for all of you being unpopular at this point.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
I appreciate people wanting to marry and all those things, but I tend to use the language of marriage equity, so that your marriage is equal to someone else's marriage. I actually bristle at the idea that a coupling should have extra benefits that someone who isn't coupled shouldn't have. Like, that to me is where it gets the legality of, we want to marry so we have the same benefits as straight people. Well, why do straight married people get these extra benefits? For what? Like, what if I want to have this connection with my mom because she's by herself and we need these protections in our relationship? Why does marriage make these protections somehow sacred? There's a way in which we've used the legalism, and I'm going to say this, and again, I'm going to get in trouble at some point, but I fear that our desire to assimilate to what appears to be the dominant culture will forever leave people in the margins bleeding and disappointed in our leadership. I'm glad that people who want to marry can get married, but again, we're leaving people in the margins of our community, the margins of the margins, who are really queer and don't want to get married and are in triangulations and don't have a home or whatever. And we're still allowing ourselves to say, we want to have these benefits like straight married people. We don't want to interrogate why married people get extra benefits. And I think, to me, I want to interrogate why married people get extra benefits. If we're going to do it, fine, everybody that's married get extra benefits. But I still want to talk about why they get extra benefits.
You're muted. Enough. We can move on to the next question. Enough said.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Do we want to move on? Okay. All right. So, so you guys are, listen, I love the conversation, but I want you to be unpopular and be okay with being unpopular in this moment. So if we, the LGBT QIA communities are carrying self-shame, loathing, and secrecy, getting back to your point, Dr. Washington, how does that impact our ministries and our leadership? Where do we draw the line between performative chastity, performative modesty, and performative righteousness? I'm going to read it again.
Well, hey, let me say,
It's
right at the center, right? Of this whole conversation, in terms of, that lots of the ways in which, and I know that in my own journey as a same gender loving man, when I got to the place where me and God was okay, like I was clear that, okay, so all right, so I did believe them lies. Now I don't believe them lies no more. Okay, so I got to that point. But just in case I was wrong, I was going to be performing holiness, right? In a way that maybe this was the problem, but everything else was going to be so holy and so righteous and so right that I'd get a pass. That I get a pass on this piece that I missed. Right. And so I believe that one of the secrets and the harms that's done often with, and I don't think it's just about LGBTQIA plus community leaders, but I think it's anywhere in which we have not embodied our wholeness and our truth. And as Reverend Will has already named, are seeing ourselves as God and having the right to make decisions and to choose what's appropriate and what's right for us, that we will show up in ways that are not only performing and doing us harm, but doing harm to those who we've been given charge over. And whether that is in the classroom, whether that is in the pulpit or in the church congregation, we will show up in those ways because we are unhealed ourselves, and have not been willing to problematize or ask some of the questions that are being asked in this space. Yeah. Okay.
Anybody else? I'm gonna keep on moving because I want to get to some meat before on this show. Now, part two got some serious. We're gonna dive into some serious conversation, but we're starting here by unleashing some of the thoughts. And so when you come back to part 2, you'll be ready for some of the kinds of things that we're really going to talk about that was already mentioned. We're going to, well, I don't want to get there. So anybody else want to respond?
I'll just give something really very briefly. Again, just as a leader, as a pastor, you know, I came out of a very traditional Pentecostal denomination. And unfortunately, around my orientation, I was encouraged to be dishonest. I mean, it was just a part of the culture. And unfortunately, too many of us, most of us, dare I say almost all of us, particularly those in the church, have not been really taught how to be completely honest because we couldn't be. And so it causes us to live in a lot of shame, to live in a lot of secrecy. And what I've come to understand is what we are as leaders and what we do as leaders, it multiplies. And so what happens is we end up being a part of the vicious cycle that we are victims of. And so where we couldn't be honest, now, because we're not honest, we're teaching our congregants to not be honest. And the cycle goes on and on and on, and we never get to a place of liberation. And so I'm, again, the way that I live my life today, and I'm grateful for the grace and the courage to live out loud the way that I do, because I have seen that that's unlocked the gate for some other people to get out of bondage as well. And hopefully at some point we'll begin to break that cycle. But as long as the leaders are bound, the people are going to be bound. And as long as the people are bound, you know, sheep beget sheep. And so there's going to be other bondage. And so I just think it's really very important that those of us who are in leadership positions come to a place of clarity and confidence to be able to help other people to be free.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a couple questions because of time, and however you all want to respond, because I really want to get to Bishop Tolton or the clobber passages. But before we get to Bishop Tolton and Dr. Smallwood on that, I want to ask this whole notion around fornication. Where the hell did fornication come from? Is fornication, even in the heterosexual or traditional, not heterosexual, but traditional setting, how do we keep, even in the LGBT communities in our Black churches, keep teaching this whole notion of fornication? Where did it come? Not where did it come from, but let's talk about fornication, and let's talk about singles who are not married, who don't want to get married, or people who don't want to get married. And if they're having sex outside of marriage, is that fornication, or is that just them having sex outside of marriage? Who wants to go for that?
Or widows, right? What happened?
Yes.
You know, I was married and now they're gone and I ain't married no more, right? Is my sex life over, right? Or I'm fornicating? All of it. Yeah. My mama was one of them.
Let's respond. Dr. Naomi, thoughts? Is fornication a real thing?
You know, I think, you know, I gotta love Paul. Some beautiful kind of high-flying theological imagination, some, you know, powerful, you know, but Paul was trying to make sense of things, just like we sitting here tonight doing.
Right.
Paul was pontificating, and, you know, I don't want anybody to 2,000 years from now be reading nothing that I wrote. Please don't. Please don't. Right. And certainly seeing it as a prescriptive kind of text. Paul was describing his situation, his context, the things that were urgent to him, his priorities, his spiritualities, his wrestling, his grappling. But Paul, you know, so Paul wrote some things down, and it might as well have been read in my King James Version Bible that I grew up with, right? The words of Jesus. Paul, you know, so I'm just gonna say it that way, that Paul's writings have been imposed upon, Paul's theologies, Paul's struggles have been imposed upon us in ways that that have people hemmed up and unfulfilled, frankly, around this notion of fornication. And let me just add that I think our ecclesial structures are not helpful, right? So we got somebody in the pulpit who has dominion, to go back to what Reverend Horn was talking about, over the congregation. And so vulnerable, we don't want our leaders to be vulnerable. We don't want you to not know. We don't want you to be, still struggling or asking questions about, right? And so I think that contributes to, the single pastor is not going to get up and talk about how hard that is. I mean, perhaps literally, right?
Absolutely.
And so
she froze. Anybody else want to go?
So I have to say that our interpretations of Paul are even more damning and damaging than Paul's writings themselves. My sister, Reverend Leapheart, like always stirs me when she speaks, because I'm back still sitting with Augustine and Tertullian, and Augustine's interpretation that because a woman ate the fruit first, then all sin comes through the woman. And Tertullian, who says that every male erection is the wickedness of man responding to man's own sinful nature. We can't have a real conversation about fornication until we start having real conversations about what shapes our ideas around sex and sexuality. Before we get to how should sex be managed and handled, we first have to really unpack how we got our thoughts around what sex is and why we have put sex over against a God who seems to be in the creative moment highly sexual, right? Like this God who has conversation with God's self and then hovers over and hatches out. And this God that we have determined is male that can hatch something out. There's something that we have to do with wrestling first and foremost with our idea of the theos before we can even talk about our behavior as fornication or not fornication, as holy, as unholy, because we're not really centering the ulteriourness, the otherness of the divine. And until we have that conversation, for me, I'm at that place of vulnerability to say, I don't know what fornication is, because I yet am discovering who God is. I'm still trying to figure out who God is. And I've spent my whole life in pursuit of who is God. And when I figure that out, then I'll circle back to the fornication conversation.
Yes, Dr. Smallwood.
I just like to interject a couple of things. One is how we understand marriage today, even though I completely reject it as a frame of reference for purposes of covenant relationship, is certainly not what the ancient Mesopotamians were doing. And it's most definitely not what the prehistorics were doing. They were hunter-gatherers, and a lot of people went to this one man because he could hunt. My point being that because fornication is considered to be an outpost of marriage, we must interrogate what marriage is and has been. And we must divorce ourselves, or at least disembowel the notion. When I use that word, I would in other contexts say just, cut the shit on this idea that we can do something outside of a thing that really is archaic and should be tossed out. Because the functionality of it, our culture has outgrown.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I want to get to our last question, and it's very important that we have this conversation before we leave, because it will frame part 2, our season finale. And that is, I know somebody wanted me to ask questions around these clobber passages, in which our community calls clobber passages. Those passages in which the church used against the LGBT plus communities, or against women who are single, or men who are single, or the widow, whomever, people who are having sex outside of marriage, or even the man loving the man and the woman loving the woman. And so, or trans persons or intersexed persons. And so I want to ask this question to two of the panelists here, and that is we're going to start with Bishop TOLTON. I want you to choose a clobber passage, if you will. What is the Bible saying about that? And can you give us a correct interpretation of what is meant from your perspective, what the Bible is saying? You could choose any clobber passage and quote it if you want to, or defer to it.
I'm sure that my colleagues share this testimony that growing up in the church, because we knew who we were and because of how much we loved God, we wanted to be accepted, we wanted to be right, we wanted to be in line. And this idea that perhaps who I was antithetical or outside of that which the mind of God produced, this idea that what I craved and desired was unnatural, I think for me was one of the ideas that really what did the most damage to my spirit. In Romans 1, Paul states, for this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions, and that they exchange the natural use of the woman for the unnatural use. But what they did not teach us was that this word unnatural, there were several Greek words for it. One was paraphesin, which really means just not characteristic or not ordinary or not to be expected. It's the same word that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 11 when he says, does not nature teach us that a man should not have long hair? Now, clearly, if you look at Dr. Washington, you'll see that nature does not teach us that you cannot have long hair as a man, because that hair he has is natural. My hair, of course, has fallen out. But what's important about that is that what Paul was saying was that it was inconsistent to Jewish culture. Because as Pastor Naomi put in the chat, Paul was often flirting with creative ideas because we serve a creative God who's created us in such diversity. What Paul was trying to do in most of his epistles was figure out a way to reconcile the differences between the Greeks, the differences between the Jews, so that they could overcome their cultural discrepancies to serve the same God in the same church. The Greeks didn't cover their head in church. The Jewish women did. The Greeks had sex between men of this and women. Jews did not. The Greeks ate fish and ate shrimp and things that crawled on the belly of the sea. The Greeks did not. Paul was trying to get them to mind what they had in common. And this idea of unnatural had nothing to do with against the mind of God or against that which is nature as we understand that which is natural, but it was about that which was inconsistent with Jewish culture, because he was making a bigger point that Jewish culture was no longer the altar where we had to bow, but we had to bow to the altar of things that are from the mind of God, therefore creating a moment of Pentecost where all of us from different cultural traditions could find the same spiritual peace.
Yes, yes, yes. Dr. Smallwood?
Awesome. I'm gonna put in the chat, and maybe at some point we can share this with the group of folk out there. There's so many passages that would clobber us if we didn't have a mind to work ourselves. And the reason I would really share this reference or this resource is because a biblical scholar has taken the time to write a piece. This was 2013 that Aubrey Hendricks came out with this particular article that says, don't blame the Bible. If you want to, take on this issue of homosexuality or the community itself, you want to call people abomination just because they ontologically have difference for sexual desire than you, just don't blame the Bible. And he goes through a litany of those clobber texts. But one of the things that I really like in the way he distinguishes certain things, because I happen to dress a certain way, and I know that, folk are always, hating on me because I am so dapper. I'd like to just kind of focus in on those passages, particularly the Deuteronomy passage and the Leviticus one, that talks about cross-dressing, or this idea of people wearing something that should be a man's outfit or something that should be a woman's. And what we're talking about here is Canaanite temple practices. And what Oprah says better than I could is that, people use that to talk against folk dressing the way they desire to dress. But that was not at all the intent. The intent was simply to make sure that the temple itself was set apart, that Kodash or Kadosh, this idea of being set apart, had its own practices. It was not to condemn anything. There wasn't, human sexuality wasn't even a part of the conversation. And so when you look at Leviticus 18:22 or you look at Deuteronomy 22:5, that is not at all the intent behind those passages. And even as it goes into the whole piece about man lying with men or as with a woman, there is not anything about the context that is about sexuality. It really had more to do with how to keep people away from powerful alien cultures. There was the need at that point to keep folks separate so that the pronouncements to the Israelites would be for them to cleave only to God. And so we really do miss a lot of the true meaning of the text. And that's why I really do admire the Jewish interpretation of the Old Testament in its capacity to really do something separate, to really just break it down, because really all it was about was how you are holy. And the bottom line is holiness is tied to godness. And if we're talking about an embodied experience with God, then all things are holy.
Well, you know what? All of us can snap, snap, snap. That ends our conversation this evening, but we have part 2, season finale of season 2, and it's going down like 4 flat tires in a couple of weeks. But listen, this has been a rich, rich, rich conversation, and we're so glad. We'll put it up in a minute. We're so glad about this panelist. I want you to give a virtual clap for the panelists that have fed us well. And of course, this conversation can go on and go on and go on and go on and go on. And so I'm appreciative. And I just want maybe 10 seconds of each panelist to say something for 10 seconds. And then we're going to close out. But I wanted, give some highlights, if you will, for part 2. And then Sue can bring up the flyer for that. 10 seconds. Dr. Donaldson, any closing remarks? I feel like I'm in church. Anything you want to say?
I think that as we engage this conversation about sex and sexuality, we have to remember that our sex and sexuality does not define us. It is merely a portion of who God has created and designed us to be.
Amen. So agree. Reverend Will Horn, I'm speaking in his existence, I guess.
Yeah, call it out, prophetess. I just want to say again, I am just absolutely enamored with the scholarship on this panel, the insight on this panel. I feel strengthened by it. And I'm hopeful that as we continue to have these types of conversations, we strengthen the body. And again, the old adage that knowledge is power is indeed true. And so we need to just continue to educate ourselves and educate one another, and we'll get where we want to go.
Absolutely. I think we're getting there. Bishop Tolton.
I'm grateful to God for the collective and individual body of work that's represented among us, particularly as those of us who, as African Americans who are standing in that queer affirming space. We are literally reshaping the horizon of the Christian church, and we have literally placed our bodies on the line as a living epistle of the grace and the power of God. And I am grateful to be named among this body.
Amen. Reverend Elder Dr. Jamie Washington.
Yeah, thank you so much again. Just joy, 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 joy down in my heart. Love being in the room with such brilliance. And I just want to say that particularly in the last part of the conversation with Bishop Tolton and Dr. Smallwood, that I want us all to think about, and I want folks who are listening in to think about, is there's not a lack of knowing and not a lack of information. I want us to think about what gets in the way of us knowing this information and doing something about it, right? Because this ain't new stuff, right? And so why is it that we can read those articles, know that information, have been in seminary, studied all this stuff, and come out of the space and still tell the same lies? What's that about? What's that about?
Reverend Naomi.
This has been extraordinary. Thank you so much for this invitation. It's good to be with family on tonight. I just want to say this, what if God is not just interested in using us? What if, that's my dog, what if we are not simply part of the plot twist? We're not plot devices in God's plan, but our bodies, our minds, our souls, all of us. God is just interested in being with us.
Yes.
That's it. And when we think about our bodies and sex and sexuality in that way, it releases some of this pressure to conform to a particular kind of understanding, right? So thank you so much. I'm so grateful for this opportunity.
Amen. Amen. Dr. Teresa.
I too am thankful and grateful both for the conversation, for being introduced to such wonderful people who have such depth of knowledge. I want to leave people with this idea. I grew up in North Carolina, in northeastern North Carolina, what we call the Bible Belt. And I say often to people that I was often beaten with that belt. But I want you to do as I have done. If you find yourself being whipped because of your desires, understand that you may enflesh your own freedom when you take communion with a God incarnate and allow that God to come into your life. And understand this, that when you do so, what you really are doing is coming into your fullness, your wholeness. And in the wholeness of your being, all things are possible.
Amen. Amen. Reverend Lewis.
I have nothing to say except thank you. Thank you all for being a blessing and for affirming what I know in my spirit, but am yet to learn in the halls of education. You affirm that I'm on the right track as I go forward. So thank you.
Amen. Well, with that being said, that is the end of our show. We want to thank all of our panelists and their knowledge. I told you they are mind-blowing. And part 2 in 2 weeks on the 27th, you don't want to miss it because we're going to go in. I mean, when I say we're going in, we're going to have Prophet Ngiri Kamara, Apostle Edward Donaldson, Apostle Jabari Douglas, Reverend Will Horn, Reverend Dr. Teresa Smallwood, Reverend Elder Jamie Washington, and my co-host at that time will be Reverend Lewis Mitchell. So it's going down like 4 flat tires. We're so thankful. Panelists, thank you for being a guest on Leadership on the Go, where we want people to live on purpose and lead with passion. And so they do that by hearing how other leaders are doing it in the world. And you are an eclectic, mind-blowing bunch. And so I am so grateful to all of you. I will see you in 2 weeks. Make sure you like, tag, and share and subscribe to Leadership on the Go. God bless you, and may heaven always smile upon you.